So I want to welcome all Ringa Kerry Irish Dance members to our discussion on those who left Ireland. It truly gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Matthew Dziennik, Associate Professor of History at the United States Naval Academy. I'm going to go ahead with Matthew if you don't mind, because I can say that well. Matthew is an acclaimed historian of the British Empire with a special interest in military recruitment in the 18th and 19th centuries, with a focus on the role of indigenous people in shaping the military priorities of the empire. He received his MSc and PhD from the University of Edinburgh. Matthew joined the faculty at the U.S. Naval Academy in 2016 after postdoctoral fellowships at the New School University and the University of Saskatchewan. Matthew has also authored the book, The Fatal Land, War, Empire, and the Highland Soldier in British America, published in 2015 by the Yale University Press. He's currently working on colonial soldiers in the British Empire in the Age of Revolutions. Matthew has also authored and co-authored numerous articles, book chapters. He has received many fellowships, grants, and awards. And equally important, and probably for those of us who are educators in this room, the most important, are the comments that midshipmen have said about this young man. And here are some of the ones I read online. Fantastic lecturer, awesome professor, extremely passionate about history, never a dull moment in class, so there will be no dull moments today, and inspirational, which I found after hearing him much the case. So it is an honor and with much gratitude for me to introduce Dr. Matthew Dziennik, who will present those who left Ireland. Oh, and by the way, I have to plug the membership here, you know? So those people who are guests, there's a reason. I want you to join. All right.
Good plugging.
Yeah, no problem. Right, there we go.
Right, okay, hello, how is everybody? Wonderful. I cannot, I'm sure everybody in the room has heard somebody else talk about them like that, and it's really painful. It's really, really painful to stand there. I am not that impressive. But I am absolutely delighted to be here today. Thank you so much. Thank you to Chuck Conlon for inviting me to begin with. Thank you for the group for receiving me. Thank you to Bill Articola for doing all the technical stuff. And most importantly, thank you to you guys. Time is an amazing resource. It's the most precious resource we have, and the fact that you're spending it here with me is truly a wonderful honor, so thank you. Keen ears amongst you will already have heard that I'm not local. I do have an accent. I've been working on it for about 40 years. I've almost got it, it's almost there. Unfortunately, it is the wrong accent. I'm Scottish rather than Irish, but I will assure you that I'm relatively well familiar with the history of Ireland. I have done things in Ireland. And please don't ask how a Scottish person with a Polish name ends up working for the US government by talking about Ireland. That is too complicated. That's probably the most complicated story we're going to have today. Well, actually, the story I want to tell today is a really compelling one. It's a really exciting one. And to begin that story, I want to take you all the way back to 1847. And I want to take you to a ship, the Patrick Henry. In July 1847, the Patrick Henry arrived in New York City, carrying some 200 immigrants from Ireland. They were fleeing the worst year of the Great Irish Famine, the Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, as it was known in Ireland. And the scale of the famine, as we well know, was utterly tremendous, and tremendous in a obviously negative way. Some 1 million people died in the famine. Ireland's population in the 1840s is estimated at about 8 million. 1 in 8 die in the famine. Another 2 million perhaps emigrate. And actually, relatively speaking, the people that were on ships like the Patrick Henry were some of the lucky ones. They could at least afford a transatlantic passage on a vessel. Many of the poorest couldn't afford that. They took ship instead to places like Liverpool and Glasgow, right across the Irish Sea. But this did not mean the story of the people on board the Patrick Henry was an easy one. Conditions were miserable. Famously, these ships would arrive in harbour, sometimes flying a black flag to indicate that there was pestilence on board. People were dying of disease. Somebody who was on the Patrick Henry described it as one of the worst ships he'd ever seen. He said that it was chaotic, that nobody knew what was going on, that everybody was all mixed in. There was too many people on board, there were too many animals on board. And most critically, that the people in charge did not care about human beings, did not care about the lives of the people on board, especially the Irish ones. And that's a really important note, because we have to remember in the early 19th century, Irish people are, to a great extent, the bottom of the rung as far as European populations are concerned. Now, incidentally, that account of the Patrick Henry, it names the captain, a man whose surname was Delano. For those maybe familiar with history, an ancestor of FDR. We won't talk about that, and it's not the most controversial thing FDR did, but we'll leave it at that. For most of us, in the public eye, as we read history, as we engage with the history of Ireland, the people on board the Patrick Henry are kind of the classic Irish immigrants. When you think of immigrants from Ireland to the United States, it's people like those that came off the Patrick Henry that you think about. Fleeing famine, fleeing poverty, arriving in New York City, struggling to establish themselves, treated often in many cases as worse than dogs. At the same time, the story I want to tell today is a slightly different story. And it's a lot more complex. Because for 2 centuries, for 200 years prior to the arrival of the Patrick Henry, people had been leaving Ireland. And they had been going everywhere. They go to Europe. They go to England. They go to the Americas. They go to the Caribbean. Some of them end up in Australia. And it's that story I kind of want to talk about. We can certainly talk about the famine. I'm very happy, always happy to talk about the famine. But it's the complexities of these other stories that are so, so interesting. Because it kind of messes with a little bit of how we think of many of these immigrants. Yes, many of them are poor. Yes, many of them are fleeing oppression. But many of them are extraordinarily successful, extraordinarily determined people who left Ireland not necessarily because they were forced to, but because they wanted to, because they saw opportunity elsewhere. And it's those types of stories I want to maybe tell. Now, in order to make it fair, in order to tell those stories, you do have to tell the story of poverty as well, because you cannot separate the history of Ireland from its relationship with England, From the very first time the English knights, most of whom were actually French, arrived in Ireland, the purpose of Ireland was overwhelmingly to serve an English need. And therefore, it is extraordinarily hard to separate the history of Ireland from that of England. Almost everything that happens in Ireland since at least the 16th century, all the way through to Irish independence, nominal independence in 1921, is to a certain extent dominated by that relationship with England. So I'm not saying we can ignore the poverty, but what I want to do is tell a little bit of a different story. And there's a few things I want to talk about, just to kind of give you a kind of sense of where we're going, so you're not just following me along. And I want to talk about a few different types of people. We'll talk initially about Ireland under English rule to kind of set the stage, but we can talk about people like political prisoners, refugees, economic migrants, and then finally we'll get to the famine migrants themselves before we maybe talk about what it all means. As I said, Ireland's history is bound up with England. The first English knights, or Anglo-Norman knights, French knights, arrive in Ireland in the 12th century. They're arriving less than 100 years after the Normans had invaded England. They spend the next 100 years stamping out indigenous resistance in England to their rule, and then in the 12th century they move on to Ireland, and they do the same thing in Ireland. The problem is that there's not quite enough of them to control Ireland, to really suppress the indigenous Gaelic population of Ireland. There's never enough of them. So many of these Anglo-Norman knights, when they arrive, they quote-unquote go native. They start to speak Gaelic. They take Gaelic wives, they have Gaelic families. They start growing their hair and wearing their beards as the local Gaels did. And this is deeply frustrating for England, because you're sending knights there to conquer these people, and what's happening to these knights? They're becoming part of the problem. This carries on from the 12th century through to about the reign of Henry VIII in England. In the 1540s, Henry VIII of England decides he's going to assert his dominance over Ireland. This is his big opportunity. He already has problems with the Catholic Church. He wants a divorce. I mean, that's basically his the entire history of the world depends on somebody wanting a divorce. It's incredible to think of. The fact that Ireland is so overwhelmingly Catholic means that for Henry VIII, if he wants to control these islands, these little rocky outcrops on the edge of Europe, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, he has to make sure that any Catholic population is suppressed, is dominated by his Protestants. And so that's why he focuses on Ireland. And that's why he starts to put troops there. And he starts to put troops and numbers of people in there, more so than anybody that had come before. Henry VIII probably puts more Englishmen into Ireland than in the previous 3 centuries combined. And this is what turns Ireland effectively into a colony of England. They go over, they defeat the locals, and they assert their control. The Irish fight back, of course, and the most famous example of that is what's known as Tyrone's Rebellion. Tyrone's Rebellion, led by this man here, Hugh O'Neill on the right there. This is a major rebellion against English rule in the 1590s. Sadly, it fails. And actually, that is going to be a common theme of today. If I talk about an Irish rebellion, just assume that it's a failure. Because every single one of them, at least for the purpose of my talk, will be. With one exception, and it's an interesting one, which we'll get to. Tyrone leads this titanic rebellion that lasts 9 years. It is utterly devastating to both sides. But at the end of it, the English remain in charge. And what's left of the Irish indigenous Gaelic-speaking elite, they flee to France. They've had enough. What this leaves is it leaves English bureaucracy, English dukes and earls, English, the well-to-do English to control Ireland. This is the moment that you start to see Protestant settlers arrive. Not just soldiers, but people, just ordinary people. They're granted lands in Ireland. They start moving over. At exactly the same time that England is settling for the first time in North America, Jamestown, the first permanent English-speaking settlement in North America, there are also people arriving in Ireland, effectively doing the same thing. They see themselves as brave colonists landing in a hostile environment. In North America, obviously, the enemy are the indigenous peoples, the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia. In Ireland, it is the native Gaels, the Gaelic speakers. And to most Englishmen at the time, there's really no difference. They're both equally as savage. And if you start to understand that, you start to understand the fear that Ireland and ruling Ireland engenders for the English. So that's the context. That's how this all starts. So who's leaving Ireland? Who are the people we're talking about? Well, the first group I want to talk about are political prisoners. In 1640, a rebellion breaks out in Ireland. Another rebellion. Guess what happens? Doesn't work. But it's a very important one. This is the reign of Charles I. This is the famous English Civil War. And if you read any of the stories, if you read any of the stories, the history books, it will always tell you it's the English Civil War. That's the word to use. It's the English Civil War. It's all about parliamentarians, Roundheads, and the Cavaliers fighting each other over Charles I. The reality is, this actually begins as an Irish and Scottish rebellion. It begins, amazingly enough, and these are some of the wonderful things about history. One person can make a decision. Charles I wants to make sure that everybody in his kingdoms, he owns 4 kingdoms, Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. He wants to make 3 kingdoms. Ireland's not technically a kingdom. Wales is not technically a kingdom, but in fairness to the Welsh, they are very, very important. So, just got to be careful here. He wants to make sure that everybody is literally singing from the same hymn sheet. The religious diversity of Britain and Ireland in the 17th century is just amazing. On the one hand, you've got the Catholics who are seen to be loyal to the Pope and therefore dangerous. And this is a long thing that runs all the way through a lot of history. I mean, even right up to the election of JFK in the United States. That fear that somebody who is Catholic is going to be more loyal to the Pope than necessarily to their own country, which is, of course, in the vast majority of cases nonsense, but that's the kind of stereotype. So on the one hand, you've got the Catholics. At the far other extreme, you've got the Puritans, the people that hate Christmas. Terrible people. I know they're very important for the foundation of New England, but they are largely terrible people. And what Charles wants to do, because he's got all of this range, he wants to bring them together. If everybody's kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, if everybody kind of believes in the same God, if everybody has the same kind of rituals, they're easier to control. So he issues what's known as the Book of Common Prayer. And he tells all his bishops, you're going to stand in your church and you're going to read from this Book of Common Prayer. And it doesn't matter who's in the audience, this is the book you're going to read from. He tests it in Scotland first. And there's a long tradition of testing controversial ideas in Scotland first. Which is a really bad idea, but we'll leave that aside. There's a woman called Jenny Geddes. Just thought, if it wasn't for this moment, would have been completely forgotten by history. And when the Bishop of St Andrews gets up in Edinburgh in 1638 and starts reading from this Book of Common Prayer, she picks up her stool and she chucks it at his head. That's how a rebellion starts. The bishop has to get taken out, he flees the church. And within a few months, Scotland is in open rebellion against Charles I. Ireland is looking at Scotland and going, well, if the Scots can do it, we can do it. And in fact, we probably have a bigger reason to object. So Ireland then breaks out in rebellion. And so even though it's called the English Civil War, it's really about Scotland and Ireland. In order to fight the Scots and the Irish, King Charles needs an army. How do you raise an army? You need money. Where do you get money? A parliament. And so the origins of the English Civil War are trying to raise troops to kick the Scots and the Irish. Great tradition in the British Isles and Ireland for that. So what the 1640s is looking like is you've got rebels in Scotland, rebels in Ireland, and rebels in England. Eventually, the person that's going to come out on top of this is the guy on the left there, Oliver Cromwell. And he obviously represents some of the more extreme Puritans, some of the most vitriolically anti-Catholics in Britain and Ireland. And so after he's dealt with Charles I and had his head cut off, it's time to go to Ireland and Scotland to make sure that the Scots and Irish know who's in charge as well. Cromwell invades Ireland. The most famous incident in his invasion of Ireland is the massacre at Drogheda, which goes down in history as one of the most brutal acts of English oppression in Ireland. Estimates vary wildly, but when the town of Drogheda falls to Cromwell's forces, reputedly he puts 5,000 people to the sword, men, women, and children. And this becomes a key kind of part of Irish understanding of what English rule really means. At the end of this, he's got an awful lot of Irish prisoners. He's got some 10,000 people who have surrendered to his armies. The rebellion's failed, they've got no other option but to surrender to Cromwell. What does he do with these prisoners? Well, one of the first major groups to leave Ireland in the 1650s are political prisoners. And the place where they're sent are the West Indies, the Caribbean. At the same time that Oliver Cromwell is trying to defeat Charles, he's also thinking about how do we make the English Empire even greater. And the place where they want to go is the Caribbean. The Caribbean is arguably the rich treasury of the world. Once those islands are clear of trees, you can plant sugar. With sugar, you can grease the wheels of the economy. In the same way that oil kind of determines what the economy looks like today, in the 17th and 18th century, it's sugar. The problem with the West Indies is that everybody you send there die, and they die very quickly. Now, if you're importing Africans, that's not a problem. Sadly and despicably, it is cheaper to import another African than it is to create conditions where people will actually survive on these plantations. And there's this belief that there is this never-ending supply of African labor. So they don't care about the people that are coming from Africa. They do care, however, about the white settlers. Because in order to keep the African population suppressed and enslaved, you need enough white people to govern the island, to form the militia, to make sure the slaves don't rebel. Cromwell's solution is to put the Irish there, to put the Irish prisoners. And there is a very long tradition of this in the British Empire. Basically, you take the group that's a problem one place and you stick them halfway across the ocean in another place. And they become your allies there. Because these Irish political prisoners, they're never getting back to Ireland. There is no way. So what are the options? Well, you try and make the best of it. And if that means helping the English economy, that is probably what you're going to end up doing. So the first great kind of migration of people from Ireland in the 17th century are political prisoners. Now, it's miserable. The number of people that are sent there and die is incredible. The best estimate is that, for example, the island of Jamaica, between 1600 and 1700, perhaps as many as 12,000 Irish people arrive in Jamaica. In 1700, there are some 7,000 Irish people living in Jamaica. So not only has the number shrunk from that 12,000, but if you think about it, they're not even reproducing there. If you put 12,000 people in a place and leave them for 100 years, you're going to expect that population to grow. Not in the West Indies, not for the Irish, and not in the 17th century. So Cromwell, you got to hand it to him. He's very, very smart. He understands that to control one part of his empire, you can use the labor from another part of the empire. Now, one thing just to put in context here, and this is important, because one of the things you will sometimes hear about these Irish political prisoners that arrive in the West Indies is that they are slaves. I am not for a second going to argue that their treatment is good or positive. You know, I've already talked about just how many die. But legally, they are not slaves. There is no evidence that any Irishman was ever enslaved in the British Empire in the 17th century. This argument, interestingly enough, actually first emerges in the late 1970s. And it emerges at this time that Britain had instituted internment in Northern Ireland. In other words, they'd gotten rid of habeas corpus and were just arresting people on the street, young men, and sticking them in jail without trial. So in the context of the late 1970s, it's very easy to make the argument that the British government would enslave Irish people. It's not true. There is no evidence that legally they were considered slaves. There is no evidence that their children were then enslaved. And in terms of the numbers, compared with death rates amongst Africans arriving in the West Indies, as horrific as the Irish case is, it bears no comparison whatsoever to death rates amongst Africans arriving in the West Indies. But this is not to say that it's an easy story. So really what I kind of want to say here is the first Irish people to move out into the world, they are forced and their lives are miserable. But they're sent there for a very specific purpose, and that is to build up the power of the British Empire there. And some of them actually end up doing pretty well. Some of the great estates in islands like Antigua or Barbados or Jamaica end up passing into Irish hands. and the descendants of some of those first people to arrive. And that's kind of the first part that I want to say about complexity. You know, there is complexity here. There is no good or bad, right or wrong. There is. I wouldn't go too far, you know. You don't want to go too far into that postmodern nonsense. But it is a complex story. And these are not the only political prisoners that leave Ireland in the 200 years before the Great Famine. To a certain extent, for 200 years from the 17th century to the 19th century, the British Empire is one massive penal colony. People are being moved all over the empire, and many of them are Irish. Many are denoted as criminals. In the 18th century, you steal a loaf of bread, you are a criminal. In fact, so one of my hero, personal historical hero, is Tom Paine. Tom Paine was born in England. A few weeks after he was born, he lived beside the Gallows Hill in his town of Thetford. 2 weeks after he's born, 3 men are hung from that hill. One for stealing a loaf of bread, one for stealing a little bag of tea, and one for stealing something that was worth less than a couple of pounds. So this is the environment people are operating in. And if you're Irish, the chances of you being convicted as a criminal are even higher. So the British Empire is sending Irishmen all over the place. Some of them end up in penal colonies in the middle of the Atlantic, San Helena, where Napoleon will eventually be sent. Some of them end up in South Africa, some of them end up in India, some of them end up in Australia. This is just an incredible, the British Empire has this astonishing desire to use the dangerous people from one place and shove them somewhere where they're going to be useful to them. And I'm going to move on now from political prisoners, but before I do, I want to just give you a kind of flavor of the types of people we're talking about. Because, like, what is history? History is people. History is human stories. You know, like, history without people is dry. So let's think about one of these people. And one of these people is a man named Joseph Holt. Joseph Holt was an Irish revolutionary from the 1790s. In 1798, he takes part in what's known as the Great Rebellion of 1798. At the same time that Britain is fighting the French Revolution, Irishmen realize that England's problem is Ireland's opportunity. So there is a massive rebellion in 1798 that tries to free Ireland from British rule. Any guesses what happens in the rebellion? Doesn't work out. Joseph Holt's an interesting one. He is a Wicklow farmer, he lives in the hills, and he develops a small guerrilla operation against the British. Even after the major armies of the Irish Rebellion had been crushed by the British in places like Wexford, he continues the fight. And he's incredibly resourceful. He develops his own gunpowder. It was very hard to get gunpowder, obviously. The British control the supply. So the only gunpowder you're getting is if you take it off the British. Holt works out how to produce his own homemade gunpowder that is useful. And he carries on this guerrilla war for weeks after the rest of the Irish armies have surrendered. Eventually, however, he's cornered and he agrees to surrender. The British decide to send him to Australia. Many of the rebels of 1798 get sent to Australia. Australia is at this moment a young colony. It's only about 12 years old, and the British want people there, doesn't matter who they are, to help develop the colony. So they send Joseph Holt to Australia. And this is where it gets interesting, because again, these stories are complex. Despite fighting against the British in Ireland in 1798, he ends up becoming friends with one of the local English militia captains when he's in Australia. There's another Irish rebellion in Australia. It's called the Castle Hill Rebellion. And it's basically all these rebels from 1798, they get sent over to Australia, and a few years later they say, hey, like, you know, we did this before, it didn't work in Ireland, but why wouldn't it work here? Much less English people here than there are in Ireland. And they launch this rebellion. What happens? It's defeated, it fails. Funnily enough, Joseph Holt does not fight for the British in that rebellion, but he helps that local militia captain, who's his friend, escape the other rebels. Like, these are complicated people. They have complicated lives. They have strange interactions. To a certain extent, many of our ideas about Ireland are really kind of 19th and 20th century ideas. You know, in the 19th and 20th century, everybody becomes obsessed with nationalism and identity. You know, what your country is, what your identity is. For many of these people prior to the 19th century, yes, obviously they're Irish. Obviously they want British rule out of Ireland. But that doesn't mean they're just these kind of two-dimensional caricatures. They're complicated people. And Joseph Holt ends up helping this local English militia commander to escape when that rebellion occurs. Holt ends up, funnily enough, he leaves Australia after that. He's kicked out, which, I mean, you have to be pretty bad to get kicked out of Australia. I mean, really. He ends up arriving in the United States. This is in, I think he arrives in 1806. He doesn't like the United States. He ends up in New Zealand for a bit, a very short time, and he eventually arrives back in Ireland. And he lives the rest of his days in Ireland, wishing that he was still in Australia. For the rest of his life, he says he should never have left Australia. And here's the other complicated thing. Obviously, this is a man who's been kicked out of Ireland, forced out of Ireland by the British government for rebelling against British rule. And yet, at the end of his life, he says it was probably the greatest thing that ever happened to me. People are strange. People are complicated. And that's kind of the, you know, part of the story I wanted to say. Okay, so what's the next group? And I'm aware, you know, it's quite hot in here. I don't want to take, you know, too much of your time. But the next group, refugees. These are people who are not kicked out of Ireland deliberately, but choose to leave for political reasons. And the biggest group here are a group known as the Jacobites. After Charles I is executed in 1649, you have a period where Oliver Cromwell rules Britain and Ireland. He eventually dies and his son comes to power. But his son is not the same caliber of his father. And the English, they don't quite overthrow his son, but they basically decide to bring the monarchy back. So they go to Charles II and they invite him back. They've executed his father, Charles I, and now they're inviting the son back. Now, Charles gets back, and obviously he has a bit of an axe to grind, because these are the same people that executed his father. The problem is, he's been invited back by them. So it's not a good idea to start executing the people that have invited you to take the crown. So they come up with a very, and this is actually not very much to do with Ireland at all, but I love telling these funny little stories. Charles II comes up with a really clever idea for how to deal with this. He wants to show that he's not happy that his father was executed, but he doesn't want to annoy and alienate everybody who's invited him back to be king. So what does he do? He digs up all of the people who are already dead that had signed the death warrant of his father, and he re-executes them.
Oh my God.
So Oliver Cromwell is actually dug up and executed by Charles II. Anyway, Charles II is fine because he's a Protestant. If he's anything. I mean, to be perfectly honest, Charles, he was known as the Merry Monarch. Like, his priority was having a good time. He did not really care about religion. However, when he dies, the next in line is his brother, James. And James is a Catholic. And this is a problem. Because since Henry VIII, you've had a Protestant on the throne. This is the first Catholic on the throne for about 130 years. The English don't like this. Anti-Catholicism is very, very rich in English society in this period. And so what they do is they decide to invite somebody else to take the throne. And this is actually one of the reasons that England or Britain emerges as one of the kind of most representative governments of the period. It's what is handed down to the United States, in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It's because they spend an awful lot of time in deciding who's going to be the king, not necessarily just accepting who's going to be next in line. So they bring over a guy from Holland, William of Orange. They invite him to take the throne, him and his wife, Mary. And it's actually, technically William is not actually even in line, it's Mary who's in line, but this is how they do it. Immediately there's a rebellion. And the lead here is taken in Ireland because obviously Ireland is still predominantly Catholic. So in Ireland, you've got a case where the British government, it's actually the English government, it's not even British yet, the English government has decided that the Catholic king is going to be forced off and they're going to invite a Protestant in. And the Irish say, like, that's our guy. You just kicked our guy off the throne. So there's a rebellion. It begins in 1689, 1690, and it's known as the First Jacobite Rebellion. Jacobite comes from the Latin Jacobus, supporters of James. They are the supporters of this Catholic monarch. They want to bring him back, put him back on the throne. This rebellion, it doesn't succeed. William comes to Ireland and he does much the same as Oliver Cromwell had done 40 years earlier. He destroys the towns that resist him, he kills the people that resist them. And what's left of these Jacobites decide, we're out of here. We're going to Europe. And these are the first kind of political refugees from Ireland, those that have made the decision to go themselves. And some of them are remarkably successful. What you have to remember is England in this time, most of its great enemies are the Catholic powers of Europe. France, Spain. These are the enemies that England is fighting. So many of these Irish people decide, what's the best way to fight England? Well, we can't do it from Ireland, but we can put a French and a Spanish uniform on, and we can fight the English from Europe. And that's what many of them do. On the left there, you've got an image of the Irish regiment of the Spanish army. There's entire regiments of Irishmen who fight in the French and Spanish armies. On the right there, you actually have what's known as the Irish Legion. These were Irishmen who fought for Napoleon to defeat the English. And for much of the 18th century, large parts, not overwhelming parts, but a good sizable percentage, sometimes as much as 10% of the French and Irish armies are Irishmen rather than Frenchmen. Now, to kind of put this in context, in the 18th century, you take whoever you can get. If you can hold a musket, you're in the army, right? So many of France's and Spain's armies are made up of every single European under the sun. It doesn't really matter. There are German regiments that are in the French service, there are Swiss regiments in the French service, there's Polish regiments in the French service, but there's certainly a good chunk of Irishmen in there as well. And these refugees, they use the decision to leave Ireland to fight against Britain, but from the point of view of France. We do, however, have to be fair, because there are also Irishmen fighting for England in this period, even Catholics. You would expect Irish Protestants to, by and large, agree with what England does in Ireland. They are a very small minority of the population. There may be 20%, there may be 1 in 5 of the Irish population is Protestant. These are the people who are descendants from those first settlers and those first soldiers who had arrived. So they don't mind English rule because it protects them from the vast majority of the population, 80%, who are Catholic. But what's starting to happen by the late 18th century, early 19th century, is that economic conditions in Ireland are deteriorating. And at a certain point, it becomes a question of money, not politics. And so a great number of Irishmen end up fighting in the British Army. And so you end up in this really strange position. While Napoleon has a regiment of Irish soldiers, there are also regiments of British soldiers made up almost entirely of Catholic Irishmen. And some of them, technically it was illegal for much of this period to recruit Catholics. And so many of these boys, they would walk up and they would say, definitely Protestant. Yes, absolutely. Love Protestantism. I'm all about Protestantism. And they would get in the army and they ended up fighting at these famous battles, Talavera and Waterloo. So you have to, again, complexity. You know, there are many refugees who who decide to leave Ireland of their own accord to continue the fight for Irish independence from the point of view of Europe. But there's also a great number of Irishmen who are fighting for the British government. And this shouldn't really be surprising if you remember what I said at the start about the fact that English rule in Ireland dominates almost everything else. If you are a poor 18-year-old Irishman and a recruiter comes by with a drum and a tankard of ale, money in your hand, and says, well, I mean, you could live on this patch of dirt for the rest of your life and die like your father in poverty, or you could come with me. I'll take you to Spain, I'll take you to Portugal, I'll take you to France. All you have to do is put on a red coat. That's a very tempting offer for many of these young men at that time. We'll move on again, but before I do again, I just want to tell a very quick human story here. And the human story is a family called the Von Lacys. They are refugees from Ireland. In the 1690s, the family of Peter Graf von Lacey decides he's not going to live under English rule, he's going to get out of Ireland. He goes to France. Now, unfortunately, serving in the French army in the reign of Louis XIV is not exactly a guarantee of getting to old age. Sadly, Peter's father dies very quickly. 2 of his brothers also die in the French service within a few years. But Peter himself survives. He fights in the French army for a short amount of time. He fights in the Austrian army. He fights in the Russian army. Many of these people are, and this is again, like we have this kind of 19th, 20th century image of national identity. Many of these guys are highly skilled, brilliant soldiers. So they go where the money is. If the Tsar of Russia is going to offer them more money than the Austrian Emperor, that's where they'll go. Peter becomes extremely important for actually Russian military history, because Peter Graf von Lacy is the man that carries an awful lot of European tactics into the armies of Peter the Great. He disciplines Russian regiments to shoot and operate like regiments in the French and Austrian service. And this is, again, people are complex. One of the reasons that Russia becomes a significant European power in the 18th century is because of an Irishman. Peter eventually passes away, but his son is also one of these great military minds. He becomes a field marshal in the Austrian army. And he becomes a field marshal. It's something ridiculous. I think he's a field marshal by the age of, like, in his early 30s. I think he's 31 when he becomes a field marshal. I think, what have I done with my life? He's important. Franz, he's important because he's one of the very few generals to have ever defeated Frederick the Great in battle. So you have these amazing Irishmen, amazing characters throughout Europe in this huge kind of military revolution that's occurring in the 18th century. Okay, so now we get down to kind of the final few parts. And I want to talk about economic migrants. The issue with economic migrants is you have to be very careful, and I try and be as fair as possible. Because there are people that leave Ireland because of poverty, absolutely, and I will talk about them. But there are also people that leave Ireland because of the economic opportunities of the British Empire. If the British are running Ireland, you do have the chance to go to France, you do have the choice to go to France, you can go to France and fight in their armies, that's fine. But it's also quite tempting just to stay within the British orbit and go somewhere where you're going to make a buck. And the British Empire loves to make a buck. Or a pound, I should say. So there are a number of important Irishmen who end up doing extraordinarily well in the British Empire. And so for fairness, you have to very briefly mention them. For example, the Earl of Shelburne. He's the British Prime Minister at the end of the American Revolution. It's actually when the Peace of Paris, the Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783, it's an Irishman who's the Prime Minister of Britain at that moment. Similarly, and probably most famously, the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington is an Irishman. The greatest military figure in British history is an Irishman. You also have some other interesting, strange stories. One of the more interesting I've always found is somebody called James Barry. James Barry was actually born Margaret Buckley. She hides who she is in order to become a doctor. She serves in the army. She serves as a doctor in the British Army. She goes throughout, as far as we can tell, her entire career without being discovered. Not only does she not get discovered, she becomes incredibly important for British medical history. She's the one that really kind of changes how the British Army thinks about the treatment of common soldiers. Common soldiers in the British Army, obviously you don't want them to die, but just how much attention you're paying to make sure they get better is not particularly high. In the 1830s, Margaret actually becomes the head of hospitals in the West Indies for the British Army. And it's reforms that she institutes that save thousands of lives of common British soldiers, including, obviously, many Irish soldiers. And then, of course, you have other famous, maybe not so much economic migrants, but possibly one of the most famous, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is known as the father of modern conservatism. He's an Irishman. He supports the American Revolution. He's an MP, he's a member of Parliament in London. He supports the American Revolution. What's often forgotten about the American Revolution is that there are a great number of people in Britain who support the American revolutionaries. Both Englishmen, Scotsmen, and Irishmen. He supports the American Revolution, but he opposes the French Revolution. And he becomes known as the father of modern conservatism because it's basically the way he talks about the French Revolution that becomes the basis for modern conservatism. Edmund Burke says basically, the problem with the French Revolution is that you're destroying everything to supposedly save it. He says, change has to happen. Change is natural. But it is extremely important that that change is managed extremely carefully and very, very slowly. Because if change happens overnight, people die. If change happens overnight, there are guillotines in the streets. And so that idea that change is going to happen, but it has to be managed very, very slowly, becomes the basis of a lot of modern conservative thought, at least in a kind of philosophical sense. So there are these great Irishmen who are part of the British Empire and do very well out of the British Empire. There are, however, also a great many more who go elsewhere. And this is where, you know, I'm sure by this point you're saying, hang on, like, where's America on all this? Where's the United States? You've spoken about Russia and Austria and Australia, like, where's the United States? Well, increasingly, many of these Irish people are going to the United States. The United States is the future in the early 19th century. It is the place where you want to be a success. It is free from the oppressiveness of the old world. And some of these people leave Ireland and become incredibly successful in the United States. A couple of names here, I've only got one of the pictures up, but Matthew Carey is an Irishman. He leaves Ireland under a bit of a cloud because he writes very negative things about the British government. He gets to America where he becomes a publisher. He's the person who publishes the very first history of the US Navy, which is relevant to me. He publishes the very first mainstream permanent American magazine. And it's really important for American identity because in the early 19th century, America's the future, but most Europeans and even some Americans think that they're lesser people than the Europeans. The Europeans are the refined ones. They say there's no culture in America. Matthew Carey's magazine is incredibly important because it makes the case, actually, American culture is vibrant. American culture is powerful. And so people like James Fenimore Cooper, Herman Melville, the great 19th century American authors, they publish in works published by an Irishman, Matthew Carey. Final very quick mention, the designer of the White House. The second White House, because if you recall, the British burnt the first one, is an Irishman. So they're having incredible success. At the same time, many of these people are leaving because of poverty. And this is where we get on to really talking about just how oppressive British control in Ireland is. The same laws that apply to the American colonies in the 18th century also apply to Ireland. The American colonies are not unique here. Irishmen cannot compete with English industry. If you're a cabinet maker in Ireland, you cannot export your cabinetry to England because it might compete with cabinet makers in England. If you do manage to get around it, you are paying heavy tariffs on it. What this does is it basically pushes the entirety of the Irish population into this underclass. Now, are there elements of industry in Ireland? Yes, of course. But it's extremely difficult to compete. And it means that the vast majority of the population are tenant farmers on land owned by somebody else. And as time goes on, this land gets divided up and divided up. You pass the land on to your sons, they have to divide it up, and the amount of land shrinks. If we're going to talk about something like the Irish famine, it's a tricky one, because it is often said that the Irish famine was a deliberate genocide of the Irish people by the British state. It's a very simple, it's a very compelling argument, but it's not true. But this does not mean that Britain was not responsible for the famine. Because of the way British laws work, it pushes the majority of the Irish population into this kind of subsistence farming, where the only thing that will grow with sufficient calories to feed people on that tiny wet patch of land that's all they've got are potatoes. And so over the course of 50, 60, 70 years before the famine, Britain creates the conditions. It's often said, you know, hunger is a natural disaster, famine is a human-made disaster. And that is exactly what happens here. Britain is not deliberately trying to starve Ireland, and in fact, more British money goes to Ireland in the form of charity during the Irish famine than any other single event up until that point. So it's not as if the British are deliberately trying to murder people in Ireland. But it is definitely the case that England is responsible for this because of the way the laws have operated prior to that moment. There is so much more I could say. You know, we could talk more about the Irish, the immigrants from the famine. We could talk more about the refugees. There's a couple of things that I've skipped over or left out. We can very much talk about the American Revolution, because the American Revolution in terms of Irish participation is absolutely fascinating. But I'm conscious of time, and I want to give time for any questions that you might have. So what I'll do is I'll finish there and just thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And as I say, like, any questions at all, please. Yes, please, at the back.
Where did the term Scots-Irish come from?
Great question. Where did the term Scots-Irish come from? Right. Oh. It's a strange one, because it only becomes popular in America in the mid-19th century. And the reason for that is really interesting. But to go back to the origin, the Scots-Irish as a people are the Protestant settlers who arrive in Northern Ireland at the beginning of the 17th century. If you recall back, and I know it was an hour ago, when Hugh O'Neill's Tyrone's rebellion fails, all the Irish leaders, the rest of the Irish Gaelic-speaking leaders, they leave Ireland. And it's at this moment that people like James I put Protestant settlers into Ireland. So again, as I said, at the same time that settlers are landing in Jamestown, he's putting Protestant settlers in Ireland. And most of them go to Northern Ireland, because actually Gaelic culture, weirdly enough, is strongest in Northern Ireland. Today we think of Gaelic culture as being strongest in the West, because it was pushed that way. In the 17th century, the strongest centre of Gaelic culture is in Ulster, in Northern Ireland. And the reason for that is because it's so tightly connected with Scotland. So you've got Irish culture and Scottish culture, both Gaelic, both speaking pretty much the same language, constantly interacting with each other. The problem, so what you want to do is you want to stop that. You want to put an end to that. So the Protestant settlers arrive. They're mostly lowland Scots. They're Presbyterian, so they're Protestant. They're English speaking, unlike the Gaels in the far north of Scotland, and they're the ones that are selected. So the term Scots-Irish comes from the fact that these are originally Scots settlers, but they had lived in Ireland for 2 centuries, almost, by the time you reach the 19th century. But here's the really interesting part, where the term Scots-Irish comes from. And this tells you an awful lot about the complexities of Ireland and the complexities of Irish history and American history. When the Catholic Irish start to arrive in large numbers during the famine, the original Irish who were in the United States don't want to be associated with them. You know, you might imagine, oh, you're Irish, I'm Irish, hey! No, not at all. The Irishmen who had arrived from Northern Ireland in the 18th century and had contributed greatly towards the American Revolution, they want nothing to do with this new group of Catholic, poor, poverty-stricken, Gaelic-speaking Irish. So they start to describe themselves as Scots-Irish to distinguish. Prior to that, they'd largely called themselves Ulster Scots. They'd sometimes called themselves just Presbyterians, but that's when the term becomes common. So I hope that kind of answers.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Please, sir.
You were to describe the Duke of Wellington as the greatest military, English military, did you say genius, or?
I would say so.
And then where does that leave Lord Nelson?
That is a great question. This is my prejudice showing. I'm an army man. Shamefully, and this is very embarrassing from the point of view of talking about Ireland, I was in the British Army in my younger days. And what's funny is, like, I joined the army in 2003. And at that time, some of our training still involved avoiding the IRA. Like, that was a lot of our the Good Friday Agreement was by that point about 5 years old. So the levels of violence had declined precipitously. But we were, when I joined the British Army, we were still talking about how do you avoid, you know, and it was stuff like, don't talk to Irish people. Like, I mean, see, like, if you're in a bar and you hear an Irish accent, don't talk to, I mean, it was just like another world. But anyway, so I'm an army guy. So I would describe the Duke of Wellington as the great genius of British military history. Nelson is unquestionably the great genius on the sea. And so maybe I would qualify it. Wellington on land, Nelson at sea. Now, the reason Nelson's less important, of course, is because he's not Irish. It has nothing to do with Ireland. And oh, by the way, I could talk about Wellington and Nelson for the rest of the afternoon, but that's not quite why we're here.
Hi, you had mentioned, and maybe I missed it, that they were all failures, the rebellions except for one. Which was the successful one?
The American Revolution.
That was the successful one.
Yeah. So, Irishmen have a disproportionate impact on the American Revolution, given the numbers of people involved. I'm not saying, so the argument has been made that the American Revolution is actually an Irish revolution in America. No, I'm sorry. I can't get on board with that argument. It doesn't make any sense to me. But in terms of disproportionate impact, the primary drivers of the American Revolution are, first of all, New England Puritans, but second only behind that are Irish Presbyterians. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, those links between Scotland and Ireland were very strong. Scottish universities at the time were world leaders in education. And the reason for that was those universities accepted people even if they weren't going in to the church. So while Oxford and Cambridge were still training people to be members of the church, by and large, Scottish universities are training people who are smart. And it means that they're taking lots of people from Ireland, Presbyterians from Ulster. And so probably the most famous is Francis Hutcheson. Francis Hutcheson is one of the key figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, but he's Irish born. He, grows up in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, and he becomes this great figure of the Scottish Enlightenment while he teaches at the University of Glasgow. And Francis Hutcheson was the most read philosopher in all of the American colonies in the 18th century. And this isn't, and I'm sorry, this may be a slight tangent, but the idea that the American Revolution is inspired by John Locke, yes, and also no. Americans are reading a lot of different philosophers. And what happened in the 20th century was it just became easy to say it's about John Locke. Because John Locke is the guy that says you have the right to rebel if you're oppressed. And he is the first guy to really lay that out. But it's Francis Hutcheson and his writings that transported that idea to the American colonies. Most people in the 18th century are not actually reading John Locke, they're reading Hutcheson. And Hutcheson had developed this idea that you have the right to rebel if you are being oppressed. So that's the first part of it. So there's a kind of philosophical part. The second part is that these Presbyterians, I don't know if anybody's a Presbyterian in the room, but Presbyterians are just difficult people. And I say this as a born and bred Scottish Presbyterian. They are just difficult people because they don't like being told what to do. They run their own churches, like the presbytery's in charge. You don't have a bishop standing over you telling you what to do. It's the members of the church that decide how the church is going to be run, right up and including who your minister is going to be. Churches could get rid of ministers they didn't like. It was very, very easy in the Presbyterian church, which means Presbyterians tend to be connected into ideas about democracy far more effectively than almost any other religious group, apart from the Puritans and the Congregationalists in New England. So all these Irish people, Irishmen from Ulster, these Scots-Irish, they're all arriving as Presbyterians. And they don't want to be told what to do. So when the crisis comes and England starts to assert or attempt to assert its dominance over the American colonies, they're some of the first people to turn around and say, we're not having this. What slightly complicates this, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take too much of your time, but what slightly complicates this is many of these Presbyterians dislike Congress as much as they dislike the British government. And that's always a problem, because when many of them arrive in cities like Philadelphia, they very quickly find they're not really welcome in Philadelphia. So they have to go out west. That's where the land is. That's where they can establish new churches. That's where they're going to make a name for themselves. And they end up right on the frontiers. And the people in the mountains on the frontiers in the 18th century, they don't want to be told what to do by the British government. And they certainly don't want to be told what to do by people in Philadelphia either. So many of these Presbyterians often end up as difficult for the American revolutionaries in the cities as they are to the British. It just so happens that when push comes to shove, there's really only one decision to make. And it is to align themselves with the revolutionaries rather than with England. So, yeah. So that's the only successful Irish rebellion prior to 1918, 1919 is the American Revolution.
Okay, so
No.
we've got military geniuses like Wellington, the Duke of, and a number of Irish who have fought with the Brits or with other military units, presumably successfully. Presumably they're taking tactics back to them, learning how to do this military thing. So why do they have this stellar record of losing? Is it just the military might they didn't have, the money, the munitions? They seem to have, likely, the skills and talent and tactics.
Yeah. It's a great question. So I would make the case that there's maybe 2 or 3 major reasons for this. The first is the divided nature of Ireland. This is the great problem for Irish rebellions. There's just too many different types of Irish people, which means at least until you build up an idea of being Irish and that's your primary identity, you're probably not going to be able to get everybody under the same tent. So one of the reasons it succeeds from 1919 to 1921, the Irish War of Independence, is by that point, everybody had sort of, they'd had decades of education, decades of Irish newspapers, decades of railway lines, which means you can be in Dublin and you can be in Cork in a few hours. You see more of the country, you start to believe that you're all one people. This is why the 19th century is so important for identity. Prior to that, yes, you're Irish, but you're much more likely to say, I'm a Presbyterian, or I'm a Catholic, or I am a urbanite. I'm not one of those peasants out in the country. People have different identities, which means when a rebellion happens, for every person that decides they don't like England, there's probably at least an equal number of people who decide that they do like England. And so that's the first problem. Irish society is too divided until the 20th century for these rebellions to succeed. The second thing, it goes back to what are known as the Penal Laws. When William and Mary come over, when William and Mary invade Ireland, they establish something called the Penal Laws, which are designed to suppress the Catholic population. So if you're a Catholic in the early 18th century, you cannot be a doctor, you cannot be a lawyer, you cannot own land, you cannot become a soldier, and crucially, you cannot own any weapons. Which means every single one of these rebellions are launched by people who, even if they have military experience in the British or French armies, have no access to firearms. And that's kind of, that gives the British army an amazing advantage. Yes, sir.
Okay, you're associated with the Naval Academy. And we're always taught that John Paul Jones is the father of the Navy. What about John Barry, where there's a memorial to him as well at the Navy Yard? At the Naval Academy.
So, what I'm about to say, if it got out of this room...
You want me to turn this off? I'll turn the air conditioner back on. How about that? Here we go.
Well, actually, the bigger problem is I'd never be allowed back in Scotland. Because John Paul Jones is Scottish.
Yeah.
It should be John Barry. John Barry should be the father of the United States. The reason he's not, and again, this tells you an awful lot about Ireland and a lot about America, right after the War of 1898, when America becomes a global power, they need a figurehead for this Navy. The Navy is the most important part of the American state because of its victories in 1898. They need a figurehead. Are you going to go with the Catholic Irishman, or are you going to go with the Protestant Scotsman? You're going to go with the Protestant Scotsman. And so basically Teddy Roosevelt decides, this is the person we're going to do. And it's highly problematic because actually John Paul Jones fought for an awful lot of different navies, including the Russian Navy. And he actually, there's an awful lot of controversy about his role in Russia. Particularly, he was accused of rape in Russia. And this makes his legacy, you know, both because he fought for many navies, for that, it makes his legacy quite difficult in the current environment. Put simply, yeah, I think it should be John Barry, but we've had 100 years of somebody else.
We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, thank you, I appreciate that. Yes.
Well, I have nothing against Jones. I don't know anything about him really. But just so you know, and I think a lot of you do know, that my husband's brother, Jack O'Brien, and my husband, I think he's back there somewhere, yes, is responsible for the monument there at the Naval Academy. He was the energy, the everything behind that monument. And it's something that our family is so incredibly proud of, so it's very nice to hear you say that.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. I mean, what's wonderful about that, in 100 years, people will still see that monument. And people will still be able to remember John Barry. Those are the types of things that make it, you know, I can write a dozen books and it won't make any difference. That monument means something. Thank you. Sir?
Yeah, some years ago, I read a book called The Great Hunger,
Yes.
which was written by a member of parliament, a woman. And she maintained in that book that a bill was raised in Parliament during the hunger to close the ports in Ireland so that the Irish would have food to eat, since they were exporting food, and that the argument against doing that was let them die because that'll solve the Irish problem. So there were a lot of strong feelings about getting rid of the Irish by death.
Yeah. One of the difficulties you have with history, and I, you know, being Scottish, this is something that I deal with a lot. If you go searching for evidence that the English hate the Scots or hate the Irish, you will find it. It is very easy to find. The question is, are those attitudes coming from people in charge? And 9 times out of 10, they're not. They're coming from things like newspapers. And newspapers will say something that sells the paper. Now, does this mean, you know, your average Englishman on the street, your average Englishman maybe in Liverpool, what he sees in the famine are Irishmen coming off boats and taking his job. So his attitude is probably going to be more along the lines of, let them die. I don't care. For somebody in power, there's almost no evidence from those at the upper levels that they ever wanted people to deliberately die. There's a couple of things here. What is absolutely true, Britain did not close the ports. So there is food being exported out of Ireland while people are starving to death. That is absolutely 100% true. The reason for that is not actually that they want the Irish to die. It's because the idea in the early 19th century that government is going to intervene in the economy is beyond reprehensible. This is the great age of Adam Smith, David Ricardo. The government believes it is not our responsibility to influence the market. So what they do is they say, no, if a rich landowner has a bunch of cows and he can get a better price in England than he can in Ireland because nobody has any money in Ireland, he is absolutely permitted to take those cows out of Ireland, and it is not our job to stop it. And that's, so, I mean, arguably one of the great tragedies of
the Irish Rebellion and the Irish Famine, and this is what I try and say to midshipmen, or what I often say to midshipmen. There are good political ideas and there are bad political ideas. But the worst political ideas are the ones that are taken to the extreme, where people forget human dignity. They become so bound up in the idea that they forget that there are people involved. And the great tragedy of the Irish Famine is that it was free market economics that killed 1 million Irish people. And it was because they let the idea overwhelm human dignity. And I try and say, and so I say to midshipmen, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm not here to tell you that one idea is better than another. But I can suggest that when ideas begin to dominate, when ideas become more important than human dignity, that's when some of the worst abuses in history happen. And so I think that the great tragedy of the Irish Famine is that it was caused by England, but it was caused by England because they were dedicated to a political idea that wouldn't let them, or they were unwilling to change. So, yes, sir.
I think an important point, everyone talks about the famine, but it didn't strike everywhere in Ireland. My ancestors came from near Carrowboy in southwest Limerick, they were actually in County Kerry. But I had a relative who was head of the school in Newcastle, who wrote in the early 1900s, 1920, that when doing a survey, he talked to everyone and they remember only finding one dead body in the whole area. But they also had a very supportive landlord who, they had set up a system. The landlord owned the land, but people could, their share, they could sell, they could buy. And so it was, at least in that area, it wasn't the same thing. So I'm not sure how different that is, but it certainly was a tragedy, but it didn't hit all areas quite the same.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Who your landlord was made a huge difference. And again, this is why Britain, England is to a great extent responsible. Most of the landlords were absentee landlords. For them, their Irish estates are simply to make money so that they can keep living in London. That's what those Irish estates are used for. Which means when the famine comes, there's nobody around to actually make decisions that are going to help people. And so, yeah, who your landlord was mattered a great deal. Even regionally, there's amazing regional differences. Imagine, like, Ireland is not a huge place. But between districts, you could have a district that was in utter, the worst possible imaginable humanitarian crisis. And you walk a few towns over and people are okay. Because it depended on how the land was being used. It depended on how many people lived there. It depended on whether you might have access to, say, fishing, which provided a different source of food. There are so many of these variations. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
Do you know why the Dutch were also landlords? Because in Kilrush, County Clare, that was not too far from where he was, it was a Dutch landlord, and they did better. They had some, they were proprietors of their own little shops, and the Dutch landlord was there. I don't know why the Dutch were there, but...
Well, okay, so I don't know the specifics of that, but one of the things with this kind of free market idea that dominates is that if you have the money, you can buy an estate. Like there should be, the idea of the government is it's not our job to decide who has money and what they use it for. And so if you have a Dutch family that have an interest in buying up an Irish estate, there's really nothing to stop them. So that's probably where that comes from, but I actually don't know the specifics of that. What's interesting today, of course, is large sections of Ireland are owned by non-Irish people. Because again, you know, there's no reason why somebody with money should be prevented from buying an estate if they have the money to buy it. So large sections of Ireland are owned by South Africans, Australians, Europeans, Americans, and it's the same in Scotland as well. The village where I come from, it's actually on an estate owned by a Danishman, who's incidentally, you know, he's the richest man in Denmark, and he owns the estate.
What's the name of the woman named Margaret that you took?
Buckley.
Buckley.
But she went by James Barry.
Right. Also, the immigrants who came in the 1740s, are they falling under the economic group?
Yes, by and large. So there's a couple of things going on here. Because of the Navigation Acts, because it's very difficult to make any industry work in Ireland, because if it competes with an English industry, it gets suppressed. You know, there are rules in place, there are tariffs to make sure that doesn't happen. It means that it's very hard to make a go of it. It also means that many of these industries are extremely vulnerable to price fluctuation. So in Northern Ireland, for example, it was linen. Linen was the key thing that is being manufactured. So an awful lot of these Presbyterian families are in the linen industry. They're in linen factories, they are tied to linen. And of course, like any industry, you know, even if only 20% of the population is actually actively involved in the linen industry, almost everything around is connected to that industry in one way, shape, or form. However, if the international price of linen drops, suddenly everybody's out of work because there's no other industry operating. So many of these Presbyterians, the reason they go to the American colonies to begin with are because they're trying to make a go of it in the linen industry. It doesn't work, and they up sticks and move to the Americas. And it's actually a worse famine than the 1840s one. In terms of the percentage of Irishmen who die in the 1740s, it's higher than the percentage that die in the 1840s. There are two reasons that nobody talks about it. One is that in terms of pure numbers, it's obviously less because the Irish population is much less. So even though it's a higher percentage of the people, it's a lower figure. It's that the best estimate is it's about 400 to 500,000 people die of starvation or starvation-related disease in the 1740s. The other reason is you don't have newspapers. The famine is one of the first great international newspaper stories. And I often say to midshipmen, like, think about communication. Like, it's not something we often think of, but communication changes human beings and it changes events. You know, and to my mind, I think, you know, to a certain extent, we're in something of a mess right now. And my argument would be that the computer revolution, the personal computer revolution, the internet revolution, we have not yet caught up to the effects of that on our communication. And I think that's why, you know, nobody's really sure what anybody's doing and why we're so fearful and chaotic. It's the same in the 1840s. There are newspapers in a way that there simply wasn't in the 1740s, which means that the Great Irish Famine, as horrific as it is, and it should be remembered and well known, the reason it is so well known is because there was newspapers to record what was happening.
But if it wasn't the potatoes, what caused that famine in the 1740s?
Yeah, so it's climate. There are 3 bad years of harvest, and at that time it's largely oats. Now oats are very hardy, but after 3 bad harvest years, there was insufficient food.
Supposed famine in Scotland. What is the relationship? You hear more about the Great Hunger of Ireland, not necessarily of Scotland, but from the little I have heard, there was a similar situation. What can you say about that?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking me about Scotland. No, so the potato fails in Scotland as well. And there is a famine in Scotland. And it's nowhere on the same scale, but large numbers, like the death rates spike astronomically in Scotland as well. The reason that Scotland is not really discussed when you talk about the potato famine are a couple of things. First of all, there are far less marginal people in Scotland, both in terms of overall numbers, but also in terms of percentage of the population. In Ireland, perhaps as many as 60, maybe even 65% of the Irish population are living in a subsistence economy, which means if the potato dies, that's, if the potato gets blight, over 60% of the population is immediately vulnerable to starvation. In Scotland, it's less than probably 10%. I mean, the margins are very fine, but in terms of the numbers of people who are solely dependent on potatoes, it's a much smaller percentage of the population. More charity goes to Scotland than goes to Ireland. So while the Irish famine was the greatest, up in British history until that point, it's the greatest act of charity. There is money going into Ireland to try and prevent starvation. In terms of the number of people involved, there's a much higher percentage of money going to Scotland. And I think what that tells you is the Scots are more appreciated in the English mind than the Irish are. And so while I've been saying nobody's really trying to kill the Irish, that does make that assertion slightly more complicated.
What about education? I think that, from what I've heard, has been much more encouraged in this Scotland.
The Scottish MPs, at least, are going back to Scotland every now and then to actually see what's happening on the ground. So that might be a reason. The education part's an interesting one. I'd need to think more about it. But it is certainly true that Scotland is a European leader in the 17th and 18th century for education. Almost every single child in Scotland in the 18th century has access to a school, which is unheard of almost anywhere in Europe. And the reason is because Scotland is heavily Presbyterian, and the idea is you want somebody to be able to read the Bible and make their own determination about their relationship with God through that text. The incentive for other faiths, Anglican Catholicism, where the idea is more often, not universally, but more often filtered through your priest or the episcopacy, means that they're more interested in Scotland in reading and writing than they necessarily are in
Very
England.
good point. Is the Irish were not encouraged to read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
even in the 20th century,
Yeah.
we were not educated to read the Bible. It was what was in the catechism.
Well, that's it. Yes. So no, that's absolutely the case. A terrible idea to let people think.
Yes.
I think Chuck's raising his
Yeah, Chuck. Sorry.
So I think the midshipman nailed it. You are a fantastic lecturer. There's no question your compassion comes through. And you're encouraging. And I think we can continue this, which we can continue, Matthew has agreed to join us for dinner. He does have to eat, but I'm sure he'd be able to chat in between a few mouthfuls.
I think I can afford to miss a few meals.
You have to eat. No, I with everyone here, I'm going to speak for everybody, even though I shouldn't. I think with such gratitude for your time, for your knowledge, your experience, we really appreciate it.
Okay, no,
Thank you.
thank you.